200,000 pounds of timber, enough to crush a house, and one machine, with no brakes, could drag it down a mountain slope as if the forest itself were alive. The early 1900s were a time of industrial hunger. Cities were expanding at breakneck speed, railroads stretched across continents, and every plank of timber was worth its weight in gold. But much of the finest wood was trapped in mountains, hidden behind sheer slopes and tangled forests. Horses could not climb those inclines. Oxen refused to pull the weight. Men struggled and failed, leaving entire mountains of timber untouched, rotting silently in the cold mist of the wilderness. Then came the iron hauler. To the loggers, it was not merely a machine, it was a steel monster, a roaring mechanical titan that consumed everything in its path. The first time it came alive, the earth itself seemed to tremble. Steam hissed from its valves, pistons thumped in rhythm like a giant's heartbeat, and drums of steel began spinning, tightening cables that stretched hundreds of feet into the forest. Trees were anchored to these cables, and when the machine pulled, the logs obeyed with terrifying inevitability. Men watching from the edges of the camp often froze in awe. The machine was alive in every sense. Its firebox glowed like molten iron. Steam clouds boiled into the freezing air, and the scent of burning coal mixed with the sharp, earthly smell of crushed bark. Every log it moved left a scar across the mountainside, ripped through underbrush, shattered smaller trees, and tore apart rocks and soil alike. Some loggers whispered that the iron hauler had a mind of its own. The drums could not be slowed easily, and once the cables began to pull, gravity joined the machine's effort, creating a force that even the strongest men could not resist. For the operators, there was no pause, no time to hesitate. Every pull demanded attention, skill, and courage, because one wrong signal could send steel snapping or timber flying, transforming the forest into a chaotic battlefield. Yet, despite the terror, the iron hauler was irresistible. It promised wealth, efficiency, and a chance to conquer the impossible slopes that had previously defeated men and animals alike. Entire logging operations depended on it. Forests that once seemed unreachable were now being cleared. Trees that would have taken months to move with horses were now pulled in hours. But the danger was never far from the thrill. Every man who worked near the machine understood that this beast could just as easily kill as it could build. And in this precarious balance of awe and fear, the iron hauler became a legend. It was not simply a tool, it was a story, a myth, a monster in the heart of the forest. By the end of its first day in operation, loggers had witnessed the impossible. Trees that had stood for centuries toppled with the relentless pull of the steel giant. The ground shook, steam hissed like 1,000 angry serpents, and the men, covered in sweat, coal dust, and splintered bark, knew they were in the presence of something both magnificent and terrifying. This was the age of the iron hauler, the machine that dragged entire forests downhill and terrified the men who dared to operate it. Its story would shape the industry, redefine labor, and push men and machines beyond the limits of imagination.
Before the iron hauler arrived, the mountains held their timber like a fortress. Massive trees, centuries old, grew on steep slopes where even the hardiest horses could not climb, and oxen refused to pull their immense weight. Entire forests lay trapped, out of reach, while demand for lumber grew at an unstoppable pace. Cities were rising, railroads expanding, and every railroad tie, every plank, and every beam was worth its weight in gold. Yet nature had other plans, and the mountains remained unconquered. Loggers tried every method they could. Teams of horses and oxen strained against enormous logs, but the animals slipped, bucked, and refused when the incline became too steep. Men lashed ropes and chains to timber, hoping leverage could win the battle against gravity, but the wood was heavier than any man could safely control. In winter, the problem worsened. Snow buried trails, Ice turned the ground into polished glass, and a single misstep could send 1,000 pounds of timber barreling downhill like a runaway train. Accidents were common, and every season men and animals paid a steep price for the mountain's riches. The economics of inaction were staggering. Thousands of dollars of timber rotted in the forests each year, lost to inaccessibility and harsh conditions. Logging companies could not wait for animals to tire or for crews to fall behind. Demand was relentless. The West was building itself out of timber, and failure meant bankruptcy, layoffs, and abandoned operations. Investors pressed for solutions. Engineers were under pressure to invent a machine capable of taming these slopes, a force powerful enough to move mountains without losing men or materials along the way. But the challenge was not just size or weight, it was chaos. Forests were dense and unyielding, trees were tangled in underbrush, rocks protruded from the earth, and the ground itself shifted with every storm. One miscalculation, one snapped cable, or one log sliding unexpectedly could trigger a chain reaction, toppling other trees, crushing equipment, or worse, injuring the men who dared to work nearby. Logging camps in remote wilderness areas were isolated. Medical aid was hours or even days away. Rescue was slow. A simple accident could become fatal before help arrived. The work demanded physical strength, courage, and a willingness to risk life and limb for the promise of lumber, wages, and survival. Men learned early that the mountains could not be reasoned with. They had to be mastered. This was the landscape the iron hauler was born to conquer. The problem was not minor, it was nearly impossible. Mountains of timber, inaccessible slopes, freezing winters, and an unyielding natural world had resisted every human attempt to claim their resources. Without innovation, the forests would remain untouchable, the industry would stagnate, and men would continue to pay the ultimate price trying to fight what nature had designed to resist. In the shadow of these impossible challenges, engineers and loggers dreamed of a machine unlike any before. A mechanical titan capable of bending gravity, brute force, and man's ambition into a single, unstoppable force. The forests themselves would no longer dictate the pace of industry. The struggle between man, machine, and mountain was about to begin. And it was a struggle that would terrify the men who dared to operate it.
The solution to the impossible problem arrived not quietly, but with a roar. Out of the forests of the Pacific Northwest came a machine unlike anything men had ever seen, a steel giant built to challenge gravity itself. The loggers did not call it by its official name, a steam donkey engine. To them, it was something more primal, more terrifying, an iron hauler, a mechanical titan designed to drag entire forests downhill and dominate the mountains that had once defied them. When it was first brought to a logging camp, it did not move silently. Its arrival was announced by the hiss of escaping steam, the pounding of pistons, and the deep, groaning growl of iron under immense strain. The boiler glowed orange with heat, and a thick, acrid smoke spiraled into the sky, mixing with the cold morning air. Men who had worked these forests for decades paused in awe and fear. This was a machine that seemed alive, each movement deliberate, powerful, and unstoppable. Engineers had designed it to take the brute force of steam and channel it into controlled destruction. The machine stood on sturdy iron frames, mounted atop sleds or rails that allowed it to remain stationary while its cables extended deep into the forest. Steel drums wound with cables longer than a football field waited to haul the weight of hundreds of trees. Every inch of the machine was forged to withstand the immense forces it would unleash. The iron hauler was a creature of contrast. It was both magnificent and menacing. It could perform the impossible, dragging logs that had defeated men, horses, and oxen, but it did so with a terrifying disregard for anything in its path.
A single misstep, a snapped cable, or an inattentive operator could turn the forest into a chaos of flying timber and shattered machinery. The loggers knew that, yet they could not resist the lure of its power. For the engineers, the machine represented progress, efficiency, and the conquest of nature's barriers. For the men who worked beside it, it was a daily gamble with death. Camps buzzed with preparation when a new iron hauler was installed. Cables were carefully laid out, trees tagged and anchored, and whistles tested to communicate the operator's commands. Once fired up, the machine hissed and shook, a mechanical heartbeat filling the forest with anticipation and fear. Stories began to circulate almost immediately. Men spoke of the first time the drums began turning, the steel cables tightening across frozen earth, and entire trees tearing from their roots as if the mountain itself had decided to move. One operator, a young man named Sam Harlow, became a legend after he guided a load of trees down a near-vertical slope without a single accident, a feat no man had ever managed before. Others were not so fortunate. The same machine that could perform miracles could also snap cables or tip massive logs into the camp, leaving devastation in its wake. And yet, despite the danger, the iron hauler changed everything. It introduced a new era to logging, one where forests that seemed inaccessible were suddenly within reach. Mountains no longer dictated the limits of industry. The age of men struggling against nature alone had ended. The iron hauler had arrived, a steel monster that promised both fortune and terror, and with it, a new chapter in the history of American logging had begun. The mountains had finally met their match, but the true test was yet to come, in the hands of the men who dared to operate this relentless mechanical titan.
At first glance, the iron hauler seemed almost alive. Its frame of blackened iron glistened with sweat from the relentless work of fire and steam. To understand its power, one had to watch it in motion, to feel the rhythm of pistons and drums, to hear the hiss of steam as it raced through pipes thick as a man's arm. It was a machine forged not merely to move timber, but to bend the very landscape to human ambition. The heart of the machine was fire. Operators fed coal into its roaring furnace, a continuous task that required focus and strength. Flames licked the walls of the boiler, heating water in tanks until it boiled with incredible pressure. From this boiling water, steam emerged, the invisible force that would drive the iron hauler. The pressure built steadily, a contained storm waiting to be unleashed, ready to transform heat into movement, movement into power, and power into the motion of entire forests. Steam surged into massive cylinders, pushing pistons back and forth with the force of 1,000 fists. Each piston stroke was deliberate, measured, yet terrifying in its strength. These pistons were connected to gears and shafts that transmitted motion to enormous steel drums mounted at the core of the machine. Around each drum wound miles of steel cable, stretching out into the forest, coiled tightly and waiting for their deadly task. The operator, seated atop the machine, controlled this monstrous orchestra with levers and whistles. A single pull or push could tighten or release the cables, bring logs in slowly, or unleash the full fury of the iron hauler. The drums began to spin, and with them the forest started to move. Trees that had stood for centuries were uprooted, dragged across rocks and soil, their bark shredded, roots torn from the earth. The ground trembled beneath the weight of the timber and the force of the machine, a slow but unstoppable pulse echoing through the valley. Men in the forest worked in tandem with the machine. They fastened cables around massive trunks, tested knots and chains, and prepared for every possible obstacle. Once the signal was given, they stepped back, feeling the first shudder of movement ripple through the steel. The logs began to slide, scraping through underbrush, colliding with smaller trees, and carving new paths down the mountainside. It was controlled chaos, every movement precise, every pull calculated, yet always with the knowledge that one mistake could turn this mechanical titan into a lethal weapon. The iron hauler was not merely a tool, it was a force of nature. Its power relied on careful coordination, timing, and respect. Experienced operators knew how to harness its strength without succumbing to its danger. Less skilled hands often ended in disaster, as snapping cables or misjudged angles sent logs tumbling unpredictably. Yet the machine's brilliance lay in its simplicity. Fire, steam, pistons, and cables, all working together, allowed men to accomplish what once seemed impossible, moving entire forests downhill with efficiency and speed unmatched by horses or oxen. And so, with each turn of the drum and hiss of escaping steam, the iron hauler transformed mountains into harvestable timberlands. It was the culmination of engineering and audacity, a mechanical titan capable of reshaping both forests and the lives of the men who dared to command it. The machine did not merely work, it dominated.
Life in the logging camps of the early 1900s was as harsh and unforgiving as the mountains themselves. The men who worked alongside the iron hauler were drawn from all walks of life, yet they shared one trait above all, a willingness to risk everything for timber, wages, and the fragile promise of survival. Their world was one of frost-bitten mornings, endless labor, and a constant gnawing awareness that a single misstep could end in death. The camps were built deep in the wilderness, far from towns, roads, and any hint of modern comfort. Wooden bunkhouses lined muddy paths, their roofs sagging under the weight of snow in winter or heavy rain in spring. Inside, rows of men slept side by side on narrow bunks, the air thick with the smell of sweat, coal smoke, and wet wool. Mornings began before sunrise, the shrill clanging of a bell summoning workers to breakfast. Meals were simple but caloric: bread, beans, salted meat, and coffee strong enough to keep them awake through the long day. After breakfast, the men set out to face the forest. Felling trees was grueling work. Axes bit into frozen timber, saws groaned under the strain of massive logs, and the constant crunch of boots against frost-hardened ground filled the air. But the most dangerous work came with the iron hauler. Crews carried heavy steel cables deep into the forest, threading them around fallen giants while constantly scanning the slopes for hazards. The tension in those lines was immense. Even the slightest slack or misplacement could turn the cable into a lethal whip, snapping across the forest with unstoppable force. Some men became legends in the camps. Operators like Samuel "Sam" Harlow earned respect by guiding loads down near vertical slopes without a single accident. Others were known for their bravery in repairing cables frozen solid in sub-zero temperatures, hands raw and bloodied, while steam hissed and the ground shuddered beneath the weight of the iron hauler. These micro-stories circulated around the campfire at night, tales of courage, skill, and survival passed from one group of men to the next. Yet life was not just work. The camps had their rhythms and rituals. In the evening, men gathered around stoves or small lanterns, sharing stories, repairing tools, and preparing for the next day's labors. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine, smoke, and wet earth. Frost coated the edges of the bunkhouses, and the mountains loomed like silent sentinels, ever watchful, ever demanding. But no matter how skilled, no matter how careful, danger was constant. Every day brought the possibility of frostbite, crushed limbs, or worse. The iron hauler, a marvel of engineering, was also a relentless force, a machine whose power demanded vigilance, respect, and courage. The men learned early that the mountains did not forgive. They had to be disciplined, precise, and fearless, or pay the ultimate price. In these frozen, unforgiving forests, life was measured not just in timber harvested, but in moments survived.
Every log pulled, every cable tightened, and every drum turned was a testament to human determination against the overwhelming power of nature and machine. The iron hauler was the heart of this world, and the men, its brave, mortal companions.
The iron hauler was magnificent, unstoppable, and terrifying in equal measure. Its power reshaped mountains and forests, but it did not forgive mistakes. Every cable snapped, every misaligned drum, every frozen lever carried the potential for catastrophe. The wilderness was harsh enough on its own. Combined with this mechanical giant, it became a crucible where men's skill, courage, and survival instincts were tested to their limits. Accidents were frequent, brutal, and unforgettable. Steel cables under extreme tension could fail without warning, whipping through the air like serpents of iron, striking men, trees, or equipment with deadly force. Logs, uprooted by the machine's relentless pull, could roll unpredictably down the slope, crushing smaller timber, splitting rocks, or burying a careless worker under tons of frozen wood. The sound of snapping cable, a shrill metallic scream, was often the only warning a man had before chaos erupted. Boiler explosions were another constant threat. The iron hauler's furnace operated at tremendous pressure, and if valves were neglected or the firebox mismanaged, the machine could explode with the force of a small cannon. Steam, hot and scalding, could erupt through the operator's cabin, and flying iron and wood splinters added to the carnage. Men learned to respect the machine as one would a wild predator, powerful, intelligent in its own mechanical way, and lethal if angered or ignored. Winter intensified the dangers. Frozen slopes turned every log into a potential avalanche. Snow concealed hazards, hidden rocks, unstable soil, and weak tree stumps that could collapse under the weight of a moving load. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, and hypothermia lurked for those caught unprepared. Even seasoned loggers could misjudge the slick, icy terrain, and the iron hauler showed no mercy for error. Some accidents became legends in the logging camps. One winter morning, a young operator misjudged the tension on a 60-foot log, and the log spun wildly, smashing through a pile of smaller trees and nearly striking the camp's bunkhouse. Miraculously, no one was killed, but the incident left men shaken. Their respect for the machine's raw force deepened. In other cases, cable snaps and runaway logs left men buried in timber, narrowly escaping death, or failing to escape at all. These stories spread through camps like fire, a mix of cautionary tale and dark awe. Yet danger was inseparable from achievement. Every life-threatening moment also brought progress. Entire mountains were cleared, timber that had once been unreachable was now being harvested, and the iron hauler demonstrated that with great power came great responsibility and risk. The machine taught men humility, patience, and unrelenting focus. It was a brutal teacher, but one that could not be ignored. In the shadow of every accident, a lesson emerged. Mastery of the iron hauler demanded both skill and courage, but the mountain and machine together always commanded respect. Men left logging camps changed, aware of their own fragility, yet proud of their accomplishments. They had faced fire, ice, steel, and the relentless pull of the mechanical titan, and survived. The iron hauler's danger was its defining characteristic. It reminded all who worked alongside it that progress came at a price, and that every triumph over the forest, every ton of timber hauled, was paid for in sweat, fear, and the near misses that haunted every logging camp. The arrival of the iron hauler did more than conquer mountains. It reshaped an entire industry. Forests that had resisted human ambition for centuries were suddenly accessible, and the scale of logging operations exploded.
Timber, once trapped on remote slopes, now flowed in unprecedented quantities, fueling the growth of cities, the construction of railroads, and the expansion of industries across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. The iron hauler had transformed the impossible into the achievable, and the world would never see logging the same way again. Entire logging camps grew larger and more organized. What had once been small crews of men and horses now became bustling operations with dozens of operators, engineers, and laborers, all working in precise coordination with the mechanical titan. Supply chains lengthened to accommodate the enormous output, and sawmills adapted to process logs at record speeds. The efficiency of these operations allowed timber companies to dominate regional markets and turn previously marginal lands into lucrative holdings. The machine also influenced future engineering in profound ways. Steam donkeys, cable systems, and early high-lead logging techniques borrowed principles directly from the iron hauler. Its combination of brute force and mechanical precision inspired the design of tracked vehicles, cranes, and other heavy machinery that would dominate American industry throughout the 20th century. Every drum, cable, and piston served as a blueprint for subsequent innovation. The forests became both a laboratory and a proving ground for mechanical ingenuity. Yet the transformation was not only technological, it was deeply human. The men who operated the iron hauler became legends. Their skill, courage, and endurance set new standards for labor in industrial America. Stories of operators guiding massive logs down steep slopes, repairing frozen cables in sub-zero temperatures, or managing runaway loads became part of the lore of logging towns. Their experiences, captured in journals, letters, and oral histories, illustrate a stark reality. Progress often demanded a delicate balance between human endurance and mechanical power. The iron hauler also accelerated environmental change. Entire hillsides were cleared with a speed previously unimaginable. Forests that had stood untouched for centuries were stripped bare, altering ecosystems and waterways. Logging roads and rail lines expanded into previously inaccessible areas, forever changing the landscape. These effects were both a triumph of engineering and a reminder that industry exacts a cost, not only from men and machines, but from nature itself. By the mid-1910s, the iron hauler had cemented its place in history. It had demonstrated that industrial ambition, when paired with mechanical ingenuity, could overcome even the harshest environments. Mountains that once symbolized obstacles now represented opportunity. Timber that had rotted in inaccessible valleys was now transformed into rail ties, lumber for homes, and fuel for an expanding nation. The iron hauler had not only moved logs, it had moved society forward, shaping economies, communities, and the trajectory of American industry. In the shadow of its immense power, one truth became clear. The iron hauler was more than a machine. It was a catalyst, a force that changed the relationship between humans and the wilderness, between labor and ambition, and between invention and possibility. Its legacy endured long after its whistles and steam faded from the forests, a testament to both the brilliance and the danger of industrial progress.
The iron hauler, the relentless steel giant that dragged entire forests down mountains and terrified the men who operated it, eventually became more than a machine. It became a symbol of human ambition, of industrial courage, and of the delicate, dangerous balance between progress and peril. For decades, its whistles, pistons, and steel drums defined the rhythm of logging camps, echoing across valleys and forests, leaving a mark on the land and the lives of those who dared to tame it. Looking back, it is easy to focus on the spectacle of its power, the logs uprooted, the mountains conquered, the steel cables stretching like veins across the wilderness. But the true legacy of the iron hauler lies in the human stories it touched. Every operator, every laborer, every man who fastened cables in freezing winds or guided massive loads down treacherous slopes carried the weight of the machine's might. These were not faceless workers. They were individuals who faced extraordinary danger daily, balancing fear with skill and risk with necessity. The forests, once silent and untouchable, bore witness to the collision of human ingenuity and natural grandeur. Timber that had survived centuries fell before the mechanical titan, leaving scars on the landscape that were both testament and warning. The iron hauler reminded men that progress is never gentle. Every achievement came at a cost of labor, of life, and of nature itself. It was a lesson in humility and respect, a vivid demonstration that mastery over the environment is a responsibility, not a privilege. Yet, for all its danger and destructiveness, the iron hauler also embodies the remarkable human capacity to imagine and create. Engineers and loggers alike took a problem deemed impossible, mountains too steep, timber too heavy, terrain too treacherous, and transformed it into a story of triumph. They did not merely move wood, they moved the boundaries of what was considered achievable, laying the foundation for the machines that would drive industry for generations. The forest, once indifferent to human need, became a proving ground for ingenuity, perseverance, and courage. The legacy extends beyond logs and sawmills. The iron hauler inspired future mechanical innovations, influenced tracked vehicles, and established engineering principles that endure today. But more than that, it tells a story of men who confronted both the wilderness and their own limits, who faced a steel beast that could kill as easily as it could work miracles, and who emerged changed, hardened, and proud. Their triumphs and tragedies are inseparable from the machine itself. They are woven into the history of the forest, the industry, and the nation. As the whistle faded and the steam cooled, the iron hauler was eventually abandoned, its massive frame left to rust in quiet clearings. Yet the story did not end. The mountains remembered, the forests bore the traces, and the human spirit carried forward the lessons learned beside this relentless mechanical titan. The iron hauler reminds us that progress is never without danger, that innovation carries weight, and that the struggle to master nature defines both our accomplishments and our character. These machines did not merely move timber, they moved men, economies, and the course of history itself. They demanded respect, courage, and sacrifice. They were terrifying and magnificent, destructive and transformative. And in the echo of their pistons and the hiss of their steam, we find a reminder that human determination paired with invention can achieve the impossible, but always at a price. The iron hauler is gone, but its story endures, a monument to the steel giants that built America and the men who faced them, a dark, powerful testament to the cost and glory of progress.